I would say we can get started, and let me introduce our speakers from the Squire Patton Boggs policy practice. We have Darien Flowers, Dave Schnittger, and Rodney Emery, and I'll let each speaker share a little bit more about themselves. And Darien, if you don't mind, we can get started with you.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Ksenia, and thank you to Quorum for having us. I'm Darien Flowers. I'm a principal here in the Squire Patton Boggs DC office. I've relatively new to the firm. I joined it at the end of 2023, joining the firm from a venture-backed supply chain and logistics technology company where I ran government affairs there. But the majority of my career has been spent in public service. I worked in the U.S. Senate and in the executive branch, all focusing mostly on transportation and infrastructure. I worked for the Secretary of Transportation and then finished up public service working for the Senate Commerce Committee, where I focus on a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Rodney, if you want to go next.
Sure, happy to. Rodney Emery. I'm also a principal with Squire Patton Boggs. Been at the firm a little more than 3 years. Previous experience includes working on Capitol Hill as a chief of staff, as well as an appointee within the Obama administration, both at the Department of Commerce and the General Services Administration. And as far as my portfolio here at Squire Patton Boggs, I do both international and domestic work, primarily a lot with municipalities and airports, and happy to be a part of the discussion.
Awesome. Welcome. And Dave, you can close us off.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for the chance to be with you. I'm Dave Schnittger. I, too, am a principal in the Squire Patton Boggs Public Policy Practice Group. I've been with the firm since January of 2015. Prior to that, I spent 21 years as a staffer for the U.S. House of Representatives, all of those years with John Boehner. So I followed him from the time he was a freshman backbencher all the way to his time as Speaker of the House. My final 9 years on Capitol Hill were as Speaker Boehner's deputy chief of staff in his leadership office. So I had that role during the 1 year he was House Majority Leader, and the couple of years he was House Minority Leader, and then the first four out of the 5 years of his speakership, and have been with SPB ever since then. So really appreciate the chance to be with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And we did have a few questions submitted in advance from our community group called Wonk Nation. If you haven't joined it, highly recommend it. And the first question that we have is, with passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, this is something like a golden age for infrastructure. How would you describe the current climate?
Yeah, so Ksenia, thank you so much. Thanks to the Wonk Nation for this, right? Because these are things that Dave, Rodney, and I love talking about, right? From my perspective, I would say is that I agree, right, that this is an unparalleled moment in infrastructure policy in the nation's history. But I don't know if it's the golden age just yet, right? We've had things that were both positive and uniquely bipartisan, the bipartisan infrastructure law, but then there have been things around infrastructure investment that unfortunately were rather partisan. The good thing is that we can all mutually agree that there's unparalleled levels of resources floating from the federal government to both states, local governments, and then even into the private sector to upgrade the nation's infrastructure from kind of our post Second World War status of good repair into the 21st century. Unfortunately, though, there are some partisan debates that are ongoing around parts of those investments. But the good thing is that overall, there's a unique opportunity that really feels once in a generation for folks who care about what I describe as the nation's economic cardiovascular system to get a refreshing is now in the present moment.
If I could add to Darien's point, I think that he's right. This is an incredible moment for our nation from a historical standpoint. It's been well documented that our infrastructure has been in need of repair for quite some time. I think there are communities, whether it's northern, southern, urban, rural, have been in a position where they've had a thirst for investment within their local communities. At the end of the day, we're talking about 1.3 trillion that was essentially invested in our country. And I think it's going to impact communities across the board. You're talking about job creation, you're talking about local economic development, but you're also talking about communities that historically may have been left behind, whether they're rural or underserved or a minority. And so I think there's an opportunity where you can see growth in every corner of the country that can impact citizens, whether it's their bridges, it's their local roads, whether it's their airports. It can be there can be impact in many facets, and I think that's why it's at the end of the day, I think it's a win-win for the country as a whole, which in itself will increase our capacity, will also increase our production and our economic growth, both at a national and local scale.
Yeah, just to pick up where Rodney left things. I mean, I think golden age, these might be laws that put us on a path to pursuing the golden age, but I wouldn't say that we're there yet. I mean, these are certainly massive laws with massive budgets, and there are opportunities for communities and private sector companies that come from those budgets and those investments. But there's something that I think has to be understood about both the IIJA and the IRA, which is that it reminds me of something that our colleague, Chairman Bill Schuster, the former chairman of the U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure, and I saw when we visited a company in Pennsylvania last year, and they made the observation that they were talking about IIJA here, which is that it's going to be implemented not at the speed of business, but the speed of government. And, translated, that really means it's going to be implemented slowly and gradually. The speed of government, for worse or for better, is the speed of bureaucracy. So what's clear is that these are now the laws of the land, and there are opportunities for years to come for communities and the private sector from these investments, but it's going to take a number of years for it to filter through the system.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have another question that people asked, and it's in any last minute assessments of the FFA reauthorization bill.
I don't mean to, use as many aviation, at least metaphors, right? But my colleagues know that I love to do them, is that we're in a holding pattern. We're in a holding pattern, right? I'm actually optimistic. Right. I think that the FAA bill is unique in the sense that it's one of the few things that Congress has to do where if they don't do it in the time frame that they've given themselves, so they don't turn in their homework on time, something bad actually really happens. Right. There is actually a cost for inaction. Right. Very many of the things in Washington where there are where we set these deadlines for ourselves, right? There is not immediate cost for Congress's inaction, but the FAA bill is one of them. And so because of that, right, I'm bullish on the idea, on the fact that the Senate right now is going to be able to get to an agreement on amendments. I likely think that means that there's no amendments, right? I think that there are likely no amendments. They're considered the underlying conference report that was negotiated between the chairs and rankings of the committees in the House and Senate ultimately is what's considered. And then unfortunately, right, my House colleagues like to talk about this, is that the Senate unfortunately jams the House again and says, okay, we've done our bit, and then I need you to pass this rather quickly. But I think eventually, it does get done, maybe with some grumbling, but it ultimately happens.
Yeah, they seem to be closing in on a final product. I mean, the telling sign to me is when you see both sides sort of working together to fend off last minute surprises that could blow up the whole thing and derail things. And I think we're sort of seeing that dynamic in play right now. Whether that means they get to the finish line by the end of this week or not, I think it's still a bit of an open question, but they've come so far now, you would think it's too far to turn back.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question that came in. And this one reads, how do you envision space operations influencing future transportation and infrastructure policy, particularly concerning space development, launch, and re-entry activities?
Okay, I'm going to nerd out here for a little bit for the Wonk Nation, right? I will tell you is that this is something that policymakers are thinking about, right? Is that we're at the dawn of a new horizon, right? When it comes to space being, frankly, a democratized mode of transportation, right? And I will tell you, at least in my last job in the Senate, right, this is something that we were thinking about, right? As we bring down the per unit cost of actually sending people and objects into space, right? That's going to add taxation, right? In the terms of not actually taxes, right? But just stress on our existing systems that we have for people leaving the Earth and going into space, people and objects leaving the Earth, right? And so policymakers are starting to think about, as we think about particularly launch and reentry, are there ways to take a 21st century application of maybe 20th century models, right? So thinking about user fees for these kinds of new entrants to fund the kinds of assets that are needed to provide the amount of safety and security that is necessary for these operations to happen without just saying, hey, in this example, the United States Coast Guard, I'm just going to need you to kind of take this out of your hide. And so there are talks around some kind of user fee for space operators. And obviously, right, is that the devil's in the details, right? But I think something kind of happens. But also just in general, right, I think that these kinds of innovative technologies are going to be here within our lifetime. And the idea of us either at extremely high altitudes, right, or supersonic flight, or this idea of space tourism becoming more and more of a reality, it's going to be something that policymakers are going to have to grapple with. And they're already starting to kick the tires on it. But I think it's really exciting, right, because it'll add the certainty for people to access this environment in a way that I don't think we ever envisioned when in the late 50s the Soviet Union at the time sent Sputnik into low Earth orbit.
Yeah, we're really at a transformational moment in the evolution of the development of space technologies. 50 years ago, this was an effort that was consumed by the federal government. We're now at a point where we're looking for policies that really unleash the potential of the private sector to take the next steps. And I think you're going to see lawmakers want to place an emphasis in that area because it can't obviously be dependent on government investment. And you're seeing sort of the stage that's been set by policy over the last half a century move us into that new era now.
Awesome. This was very insightful. And we have a new question. And the question is, there's a great deal of talk about America's charging network for electric vehicles and whether it can support increased sales, which is part of Biden's administration agenda. The Inflation Reduction Act have money for increasing the network. Do you think this is enough?
Rodney, do you actually want to talk about this, right? Because I think that we've actually done some work here that actually I think is on the leading edge here of this that I think that is applicable.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think at the end of the day, obviously the Inflation Reduction Act was created as a vehicle to give essentially incentives to companies to invest in clean technology. And within that space, obviously, there is the issue with regards to electric vehicles and whether we have the infrastructure in place to essentially support the purchasing and the usage of such vehicles. There are a number of provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's providing write-offs or tax incentives to create more chargers, which obviously will drive more electric vehicle production and ownership, as well as placing those stations within those designations where folks are going to most need them, whether that's on interstate highways, whether that's in cities, in rural communities, et cetera. Let me also say that I know the question is specifically referencing the Inflation Reduction Act, but the overarching question is obviously, is there enough money, right? And I think related to that is the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has set aside $2.5 billion to essentially create 500,000 charging stations. I think this is, in my opinion, a fluid development. I think obviously the administration, the Congress will have to monitor and look at, as the American public buy or consume more electric vehicles, ascertaining what those needs are. I don't think anyone has the exact number. It's sort from a formulaic standpoint of knowing, okay, these number of vehicles, these number of chargers. I think my colleague Schnitt mentioned earlier, when you're dealing with government investment, it moves at a different pace than private sector, right? So I think balancing consumer consumption and the need for such infrastructure for those products will also be a key with regards to how the government moves accordingly, with making sure that the right amount of funding is in place with regards to providing the necessary support. I do think Congress will strongly take a look and take the necessary steps to make sure that such investment and infrastructure is in place. And the beauty about it is, I think it's a bipartisan issue that I think both Republicans and Democrats can come to an agreement on as far as what's needed to provide the necessary funding for charger investment.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point Rodney made, which is even prior to the IRA, the IIJA included billions of dollars in discretionary grants for building out EV infrastructure across the country. But as we keep getting back to, it's the pace of implementation and the speed of government has been a factor there. The implementation so far has been pretty sluggish. There's been concerns at the state level about labor contracting requirements. There have been delivery problems with some of the chargers. And I think it was as of last December, there were 7 or 8 charging stations that were operative as a result of the law at the 2-year mark of its implementation. So there's a long way to go. But there is another core question, which is, just building the network, no matter how quickly you do it, does that actually create a consumer demand for electric vehicles? And I think that's still a topic of debate on the Hill.
Yeah, I would agree. Right. I would just add one bit to Schnitt's point about consumer demand, is that I think that there's a real question mark about consumer demand, right? I think what we've seen right at the beginning of the IRA and the implementation of the IIJA, right, is a pretty steep ascent on electric vehicle consumer demand. What I am unclear about is if that demand will continue, particularly for this type of vehicle, or will it kind of quickly, or will it not quickly, but will it moderate to the point where what we will see is that adopters of these types of vehicles were likely going to be at one full EV per household. And so you see a kind of a mixed propulsion household phenomenon happening, where a family might have one full EV that is dedicated for kind of intra-city travel, and then maintain a traditionally powered vehicle for long road trips. And does that level off demand in a way that actually the resources under the IRA are actually enough to support the demand that actually becomes a little bit more moderated compared to at the time when it was when these programs were created, that it was described as a down payment for future investment. Rather, it might actually meet the requisite amount of demand.
Awesome. We have another question coming from Susan Nelson, who said that she admittedly have not scrubbed the IRA, And her question is, do you see credits and incentives in it for companies that are expanding their heavy vehicles to electric?
I believe, Susan, yeah, the short answer is yes. But this actually goes back to what Rodney and Schnitt have been talking about, though, is at the speed of government. I think one overall area of feedback that we could give to our friends and former colleagues who are still in public service, though, is that we understand that implementation is hard, right? But that there might be a need for velocity, right? And that there are things that, in order to enable the public to leverage the incentives that these laws create, we need to add velocity in terms of how government is going to deploy these programs, right? And some of the tail work around permitting reform, frankly, making hard decisions, right? Is that, unfortunately, I think some of the things that are tying this up, right, are these kind of competing, frankly, policy interests around labor, the environment, Buy America, and trade, right, are all kind of converging. That's slowing down some of the investment compared to if the administration has said implementing these programs are a priority, then doing them with an understanding that there might be some small p political cost to doing so is probably in their own long-term interest to do them versus kind of trying to look for the perfect solution and then roll it out.
Yeah, I would just add that I think at the end of the day, I think private sector understands and appreciates that they're going to be trillions of dollars in incentives to convert and to align themselves with the purposes or the mission of IRA, which is clean technology, right? I think when you look at whether it's oil companies converting to hydrogen, or you're looking at solar manufacturers setting up shops in red states like Georgia, when you look at essentially lithium battery makers are opening factories near auto industry hubs, I think you're seeing the private sector gravitating toward these opportunities. And so I can't speak specifically to heavy vehicles whether it includes heavy vehicles to electric, but I do know collectively as a whole, the private sector sees the opportunity. And I think there is where you find the alignment between, oftentimes there may not be alignment between policy and the private sector, right? But I think in this instance, there is alignment. You see investment and you see where it's a win-win for both sides.
Yeah, I can't speak to the heavy vehicles question specifically, but I think there is a certainty question with respect to some aspects of the IRA as we look ahead to implementation, is that there is obviously still a political debate taking place. If you want to frame this in terms of at least the campaign rhetoric being used right now, there's a lot of talk among congressional Republicans and Republican presidential campaigns about repealing the IRA. Now, I think personally that's unlikely to happen, at least in its entirety. For Republicans to repeal the law, they would essentially need to have control of the White House, the House, and the Senate, and numbers in both of those chambers sufficient to overcome what would be enormous Democratic opposition, obviously, to taking the law off the books. But I think if you dig deeper too, Republicans many will admit that there are significant components of the law that they actually support. So the notion that the law might be repealed wholesale, I think is pretty unlikely. But there may be elements of the law targeted, particularly if you get into 2025 and you have Republicans in power in a significant way in Washington. There's going to be the need to address the expiration of some of the main Trump tax policies that were set in motion in 2017. They're going to want the revenue that is necessary to extend some of those tax cuts that are expiring, and they may look to the IRA. And I think if you had to list which programs are first to be targeted within the IRA by Republicans in that scenario, it's probably going to be in the area of EV policy. So that's a little bit of an asterisk, a little bit of uncertainty out there on the horizon for that aspect of the law, I think.
Thank you. And before we jump to the next question, I do want to remind people to vote for a question they like to see answered. And if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. But the question that we have is from Dave McCarthy, and he asks, the Build America, Buy America domestic content requirements in the IIJA are ambitious as the U.S. has offshored much of its manufacturing in recent decades. As waivers are phased out, will transportation projects be stalled due to lack of domestically made components?
I would say, so Dave, it's a good question, right? I think in the immediate, stalled is not the right word, right? But at least I think in the bipartisan infrastructure law, right? Many of the investment authorities that are given to the administration, right, and particularly the Department of Transportation, are discretionary. And so I just think that given that that domestic content requirements are consistent with, frankly, President Biden's political agenda, right? I think it is unlikely that you're going to see sizable awards from the department that have a notable Buy America waiver as part of them, right? Rather, I think that you're going to see the department make decisions around the awards that are, obviously first and foremost consistent with the law, right, and their authorities, but also consistent with the administration's opinion around domestic content requirements. And so I think you're going to just see them leverage their discretionary authorities to make sizable investments. But I do agree with you, right, that this is a perpetual question. And it kind of goes back to what we've talked about before, right? Is that there are just certain kinds of components that are just not made in the US. And the lead time to create some of these industries is measured in decades.
I would agree with what Darien is saying. I would make the assertion that I think it's a balancing act, right? I think you're looking at the procurement requirements that have been imposed within the bill, but I also think you have to look at the overarching objective of the bill itself or the law itself. I think you have to look at the fact that what we're past the 2-year mark, and the bill is in full bloom with recovery of the dollars, and the goals are set forth with the legislation itself. In light of the fact where I think this will become a question later on in a discussion, we're in an election year. And so I think if you separate the sort of the text and the policy from the politics of it are that obviously I think the Biden administration knows that there is a possibility that there could be a different administration that comes in after the November election. And therefore there is the urgency to accomplish and see how much of what IIJA was set forth. It is law. It is authorized. There could be some tinkering around the edges by another administration or another other stakeholders with regards to that process. But I do think that, to your point, I don't think it stalls it. I do think there could be some change in momentum, let's say, for lack of better words. But I do think ultimately it's a balancing act where maybe on a project by project basis, you're looking at the ultimate outcome and the ultimate win, which was the intent of IIJA when it became law.
So now we touched upon this question already, but a lot of people voted for it, so I'm going to ask it. The election will decide which party controls the White House and Congress. How do you think this will impact infrastructure investment?
Well, I'll start because I think I sort of began to touch on this. And anyway, the Republican agenda, at least rhetorically right now, is one where they'd like to repeal the IRA. But I think if you dig a little deeper, there are plenty of Republicans who have found things in the law to like. Maybe they like 60% or 70% of the law and disagree with the remaining percentage. I think as the law begins to have effect in congressional districts across the country in the form of jobs and results for consumers, those percentages probably go up a little bit. But, as of right now, it is something that is at least rhetorically in the crosshairs of the Republican Party, and the degree to which Republicans have control after the November 2024 elections is going to be a determinant of how the law changes, if it changes. And I think another question that will be decided by the November 24 election is how congressional oversight is going to be performed with respect to the implementation of the law. You've got one party in the White House is going to take one approach to implementation, the other is going to take a different approach. And then if you have a different party controlling Congress, they will utilize their congressional oversight authority to ask tough questions of the administration that if it's one of the opposite party from Congress. So these are big question marks that'll be resolved only by the 2024 election in November.
I would say from the Democratic perspective, obviously, full steam ahead, right? If the laws in themselves, IIJA and IRA, can stay as is. Obviously, we're dealing with a mixed government. I think IIJA is pretty much will remain intact. I think with regards to IRA, as Schnitt mentioned, there could be some changes around with regards to maybe some of how the tax credits have been administered. You have to essentially look at it from a standpoint of administrations have different priorities, different congressional majorities have different priorities. And so those majorities essentially dictate whether short-term or long-term, what their priorities are and how they will go about with regards to, as Schnitt mentioned, dealing with existing law or the path forward with those priorities will dictate where resources will be directed. So I think if anyone tells you they know exactly how November will turn out, I think, that you have to sort of maybe take that with a grain of salt, because we're dealing with two slim majorities in the House and Senate. Obviously, folks are paying attention to the polls regarding the national presidential race, which is obviously in the balance as well. So I think at the end of the day, I think what my colleagues and I think could agree on, there may be questions as to how it's administered, but I do think there is a bipartisan commitment to infrastructure investment from a standpoint of, do you want good services at your airport? Do you want good services with regards to supply chain deliverable of trade at your ports? Do you want safe roads? Do you want safe streets? Do you want other investments in infrastructure that will lead to local and state economic development, growth, and job creation? I think that in itself is the beauty of infrastructure from a standpoint that it's an American issue that I think Democrats and Republicans can coalesce around and come to an agreement. How it's done and the process of how it's done, obviously there is some difference, but I think the ultimate end result is something that I think is a win-win for the country.
The things I would add to what my colleague said is that I agree, right, is that irrespective actually of who controls Congress and who controls the White House, right, I think that you're going to continue to see a unique emphasis on safety, right, amongst infrastructure investment, right? Our transportation systems are the safest in the world, right, here in the U.S., right? But the traveling public has to have confidence in the safety of these systems, right? And so I think you're going to continue to see a uniquely bipartisan focus on safety. I agree with Rodney's point on implementation, right? I think you're going to see the biggest shift there in terms of the difference between of how November will shape this, right? It's kind of well documented where the administration is going to kind of continue full speed ahead and double down maybe on the greatest hits of the president, right? If he is reelected. But if President Trump returns, right, I think you're going to see a slightly different perspective to infrastructure policy than maybe he had in his first term. And that primarily comes is that I don't think that there's going to be as much particularly disagreement between the executive and legislative branches if President Trump were to return, in terms of what resources are dedicated from the Congress to the administration to do for X purpose. Rather, I think that President Trump's second term will be uniquely focused on deploying those resources towards bits of infrastructure that align with his particular perspective, right? And so you will likely see a surge in investment in the civil nuclear sector in a way that has been different under this administration, right? You'll see, frankly, transit investment in different areas of the country, right? So outside of the Northeast Corridor, right? And you will likely see transit investment in and leveraging probably public-private partnerships in different parts of the country. And then lastly, right, though, is that one of the things that I will see is that irrespective of who wins is that the calendar is a little bit in terms of infrastructure policy, we're almost all beholden to the calendar, right? And it's hard to believe, though, that while the bipartisan infrastructure law, it feels like a while ago now politically, right? We're coming up on the horizon for another surface transportation reauthorization. And so Congress is going to be forced to adjudicate these things, whether it be roadway policy, transit policy, motor vehicle policy. But I think uniquely, right, in this effort, right, you will likely see rail policy included in this effort in a way that it historically hasn't been. And all of that is going to have a unique opportunity for stakeholders to engage, advance priorities, but also refocus emphasis on different priorities that they may not be seeing get the attention currently.
Thank you so much. And we have a new question from Erica Johnson-Creamer, who asks, your top 5, what are you watching for the remainder of this Congress and then for the next Congress?
Well, the list for this Congress is being diminished rapidly before us. There really, I think it was written up in Punch Bowl this morning that one of the things working in Mike Johnson's favor in terms of him being able to retain the gavel is that there isn't that much must-pass stuff left on the agenda. They're dealing with FAA right now. There are people who'd like to get a farm bill done, but I don't think a lot of people expect that that's going to happen. There'd probably be an extension to take it into next year. You've got the appropriations bills coming up. But beyond that, the focus is already beginning to turn to 2025, and that's particularly in the area of tax policy. I talked about this a few minutes ago a little bit. In 2025, you've got, I call it the fiscal Armageddon, which is because you have the debt limit has to be dealt with. You also have the expiration of a number of about 2/3 of the Trump tax cuts that were enacted in 2017. So have a monumental task with respect to fiscal policy that people are already beginning to talk about on the Hill. Jason Smith, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, in the last week or two has formed discussion groups to start sort of formulating policy prescriptions for dealing with the expiration of those tax cuts next year. So I think when it comes to the outlook for 2025, the next Congress, this fiscal Armageddon, as I call it, where you have the debt limit and the expiration of those tax cuts coming together, is got to be number one on the list. And I call it that because when I was in the Speaker's office, I lived a number of nightmares. The first was the debt limit battle between Speaker Boehner and President Obama in 2011 over the debt limit. Then a year later, with the approaching expiration of the Bush tax cuts, we dealt with the fiscal cliff. Those were monumental policy debates, policy clashes, but they were a year and a half apart. Next year, you've got them essentially pushed together within the same calendar year. And that is going to color a lot of what Congress talks about next year, regardless of who's holding the levers of power.
Yeah, I would agree with Dave from a standpoint that if you've watched with regards to what Ways and Means and Senate Finance have worked on, the 2024 tax package appears right now stalled in the Senate. That in itself was looked upon as a potential sort of appetizer to what will be the 2017 expiration of the Trump tax cuts, as Dave mentioned, with regards to 2025. I think another big issue that is permeating right now, as well as next year, is going to be the framework and provisions as it relates to artificial intelligence. I think that's huge from a standpoint that when you think of AI, it's not just one generic sort of issue from a standpoint that it correlates with, it touches everything. It touches transportation, it touches healthcare, it touches financial services, every component of American or of society in general. AI is a huge issue from a standpoint, even like, let's say hypothetically, worker protections, workforce environment, the environment itself. It sort of touches every component. The other piece that I would mention also is where we are with regards to a stalled trade agenda, which impacts both internationally and domestically. From a standpoint, there have been no free trade agreements within this current administration. I think that's to the frustration of both Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, they like to see something more robust. Trade, as you know, impacts our national economy. It can also impact our various aspects of our transportation system. So from my vantage point, I would definitely say my top three, obviously, as my colleague Dave mentioned, tax is probably near the top, but AI and trade are two big items that one's in sort of percolating and moving along. Obviously, there's going to have to be consensus between the House and Senate. They're sort of competing with regards to who takes the lead on that. But I think AI is something we can't ignore. It's here, and it's going to continue to be a bigger part of our future moving forward. So you'll see Congress and the administration, respective administration, engaged on that policy front for years to come. And trade, quite frankly, has not been where I think many pro-traders wish it would be. And obviously, that's something I think the next Congress and the next administration will tackle from a standpoint of how do you help American companies, manufacturers, and exporters access markets, bring their products to the global marketplace, and obviously, how do we manage and control imports? And obviously, that leads to a whole nother discussion with regards to our competitors, i.e. in China, for instance, with regards to how that global economy impacts our national economy. So I see those as my top three for this Congress leading into the next Congress and the next administration.
Erica, I saw your note here about specifically talking about supply chain and infrastructure policy. So I'll give you kind of my three for currently and then looking into 2025 and beyond, right? So currently, right, most pertinent, right, is the FAA bill going to take off or is it going to stall, right? I personally think it's gonna take off, right? I think we're going to get done by May 10th, right, or right around there, right? There might be a scenario where we have a short term, like maybe like less than a day amount of shutdown of the FAA, right? But I don't think that we're going to see a scenario where you have long-term extension, right, and lots of inaction. Okay, so FAA is one, right? The other is frankly summer travel season, right? As we all start to approach the Memorial Day holiday, right? That is the kind of the kickoff to summer travel season, right? And now beyond, that we have the pandemic officially in our rearview mirror, right? I think Americans want to hit the road, right? They want to connect with friends and family. They want to go on vacation. And I think that policymakers are mindful of that. And so I'm really watching summer travel season because the Department of Transportation has released some recent consumer protection related priorities that I think, while well-intentioned and have the potential, or like they think are going to protect consumers, right? Democratize access to travel, right? I worry that some of these actions, right, as related to kind of particularly aviation consumer protection, are one, of questionable legality, and two, we're actually going to impede the ability for consumers to access the products that they actually are telling, based upon voting with their dollars, that they want access to. And then lastly, right, it's kind of outlier events, right, like the Francis Scott Key Bridge, and right, how do we adjudicate those? And just generally outlier events in the transportation system that are going to inject themselves into the political fray, right? So one that's pretty tactile, one that is coming up here, and then kind of trivia as the other things that we're looking at in terms of supply chain and transportation infrastructure policy. Looking forward, it's the calendar again, right? We've got to do a highway bill, right? And so what does all that mean, right? Because the highway bill is no longer just about Federal Highways Administration and NHTSA. It adds, Congress is more and more interested in FTA, right? Because of some high profile events in the rail sector, right? You're almost certainly going to have a rail title where Congress is going to adjudicate some priorities about rail policy, both on the safety side, but also on the infrastructure investment side, both in the commuter, passenger, and freight environment. But then add on there that there's an element of hazardous materials policy that's added in here. And then separately, right, but I think I see a scenario where all these things, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, can get merged, is that there's also a midstream reauthorization, the pipes function of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration authorities are expired as well, right? So Congress is going to have to figure out how to adjudicate those. And then moving forward, right, it's all the things that my colleagues talked about, right? If there is a change in administration, right, the other thing that I'm thinking about is policy, right? I worked for a Secretary of Transportation who was fond of saying personnel is policy. And so the fact is that if President Trump does return, right, a huge amount of Q1, right, I think of 2025, for those of us who follow this, is going to be about who's going to staff the incoming administration from an infrastructure perspective. Who are these folks? And how are they going to move through the Senate confirmation process that unfortunately is pretty broken? And so what does that mean for all of the policies that we've talked about? And then lastly, right, I think it's oversight, right, in looking into the horizon, right, is that I suspect, right, that we are going to still be in a scenario of divided government. And so, like, how does oversight create friction to advancing policies, or keeping them at a above the fold, right, as we are fond of saying here inside the Beltway, in terms of prioritization? And so you wrap all of those together, it's a full plate on top of all the things that Schnitt and Rodney just talked about that are paramount that we do. So a lot's going to happen, a lot of opportunity for stakeholders to be involved. And, I don't know about you guys, I'm pretty excited about it.
Thank you so much for this answer. And we do have one more question from Peter Phipps, Key Bridge funding. What are your predictions on the speed in which this will go through Congress, and what does the accident hold for future bridge construction across the nation?
I would say, so my guess right now is that this is going to be delayed, right? I know that there is a lot of interest from the Maryland delegation. There's a lot of prioritization from the administration about this. However, the prioritization feels a little bit kind of at the 101 level. And within the last couple of weeks, right, the Department of Transportation has said, we actually don't know how much money that we're talking about, right? And so I just think that, not from a particularly ideological perspective, right, I just think mechanically, right, some of these things, unfortunately, these things are outliers, right? Elisions are outliers, catastrophic elisions are outliers. And so I think it's just going to take time for the Department of Transportation, working with their partners at the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, right, to figure out exactly how much are we talking about? And then going through the machinations of Congress. And I just think, unfortunately, they're going to pass each other in terms of doing all that homework and then getting to Congress. I don't see a special standalone supplemental coming along. And so if that happens, we're kind of in a CR through the rest of the fiscal year. And so I think this becomes something for the beginning of the calendar year 2025.
As a Maryland, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say I'm a Marylander, so obviously the Key Bridge is a big topic for me and my neighbors. I would say, and I think Dave and Darien would agree with me, I think that the commitment there for the cleanup and the first phase of it, obviously, I think will take care of itself. I agree. The funding, which is much more of the construction of the reconstruction of the bridge is a much longer question and issue. I do think the November election will play a role within this dialogue. Are you looking at same majorities? Are you looking at a change of majorities? Are you looking at a different administration? This is an administration that has prioritized domestic infrastructure investment versus if there is a Trump 2.0, where will President Trump fall with regards to the prioritization of the bridge? I do think it will eventually get done. The timeliness obviously is the $1 million question. And as far as future bridge construction, I don't know. That's going to come down to the priorities of the respective administration and of the next Congress. I do think it's an instructive lesson. I do think it reiterates why IIJA was such an important and landmark legislation with regards to its initial intent of infrastructure investment. And I do think that, unfortunately, disasters like that happen for a reason, and it brings to the forefront the urgency of why we must act now. But as time goes, that urgency lessens, right? So I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion, and it's a great question, because what happened to the Key Bridge could happen to a number of other bridges across the country. So stay tuned as far as where that future conversation will occur in the future.
Yeah, I think there is a generally widely shared commitment in Congress to the reconstruction, to getting that done. The legislation to do that, how quickly it moves once the price tag is made definitive. The question is going to be the scope of the actual legislation. Is it narrowly focused on rebuilding the bridge, or does this become a vehicle that is perceived by some to kind of do more than that, and maybe a chance for some of their priorities to take a ride on this? And that's the type of thing that could potentially slow this down. You've already seen the House Freedom Caucus within a couple of weeks of the tragedy lay out some of the lines it wasn't going to want to see crossed, or it might withhold its votes from such legislation. Now, you could argue the speaker has decided to find a way around that anyway, but we need to see what the bill is going to look like. But I think scope is going to be the key question. The more people try to tack things on, the easier it is for others to sort of drop off and say, I'm not going to be part of this. And that's the kind of thing that can slow down something that at least initially looked like it would be inevitable and would move quickly.
And Dave, if I could, just as a counter colloquy, you would probably agree it's hard to get standalone bills. Generally, both Republicans and Democrats usually try to find opportunities to where they can add a rider or add another issue to that particular bill. So I'm in full agreement with you as far as scope and seeing how clean of a bill can be crafted in both the House and the Senate.
The only other thing I'll add here is that I actually see that this tragedy was horrific, but I think it really presents a real opportunity for innovative project finance and delivery. If I were a large infrastructure investor, I think this is actually an opportunity to, invest in a key piece, a key asset of American critical infrastructure, but also the math, right? Actually, from I think an infrastructure investment perspective, it can be actually be pretty accurate because this asset was an existing toll bridge, right? And so the toll data around traffic patterns, revenue projections, right, could actually be rather accurate, and you could project out with a high degree of certainty what your cost recovery horizon would be. And so if I was a large infrastructure investor, I would probably go to the federal government and say, listen, let's do a P3. We will come with resources and funds to provide, actually capital expenses. What I need from the public sector is actually a reduction in friction, right? The federal government needs to remove some of the barriers that we talked about when it comes to kind of onerous environmental regulation, just generally the permitting process, right? To expedite the delivery of this kind of asset to not only probably beyond what would be a kind of a state of good repairs, which the federal government would build it back towards, but if you have private sector design, engineering, and resource capabilities mixed with friction reduction from the public sector, I actually think that you get a 21st century asset in return, and something actually very positive can come out of this unfortunate tragedy in a way that probably is actually cheaper than doing it alone with and faster than a directly publicly funded asset.
Thank you so much for answering those questions. And unfortunately, we do have to start wrapping up the session. So if we didn't get to your question, really sorry about it. But thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you again for our wonderful speakers for your time and your expertise. As a reminder, we will be distributing the recording in the next day or two. So please keep an eye out on that. And if you'd like to learn more about Squire Patton Boggs policy practice, please visit the doc tab to download their brochure. And once again, thank you so much for your time, and please have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you all so much for having us. We have loved this. As you can probably see, we could talk about all this all day. So thanks so much for allowing Dave, Rodney, and I to share a little bit of your afternoon with you, or your morning if you're on the West Coast. This is great.
Yep. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the discussion.